Every empire dreams of living forever. The Habsburgs did something strange. They built an empire on the richest silver mines on earth, the kind of wealth other rulers could only fantasize about, and then, somehow, they kept going bankrupt. On paper, the most powerful monarchy in Europe collapsed again and again, in 1557, in 1560, in 1575, in 1596. The dates read like a grim accounting calendar. And yet the armies marched, the fleets sailed, and the empire survived. So here's the unsettling question that history refuses to let go. Were these really financial disasters? Or was bankruptcy itself part of the plan? A weapon, a pressure valve, a tool in the ruler's toolkit, used as deliberately as a new tax or a new law, default not as an accident, but as policy. Because when you look closely at the Habsburg ledgers and at the people who sat across the table from them, you find something deeply uncomfortable. The borrower from hell, as some historians later called the Spanish crown, discovered that sometimes the easiest way to rule the world is to simply not pay your bills in full, or at least not on the terms you originally agreed to. We like to think of bankruptcy as failure, a humiliation. The end of the story, the business shuts down, the debtor is disgraced, the credits roll. But under the Habsburgs, bankruptcy became something else entirely. It became a reset button, a bargaining chip, a way to push pain onto specific creditors, reshuffle the financial deck, and keep the imperial machine running for just a little longer. Castile, the economic heart of Habsburg Spain, became one of the first true serial defaulters in recorded financial history. And yet, for most of the 16th century, it remained a dominant European power. The numbers in the books looked impossible. The commitments looked unsustainable. But the wars continued. The palaces were built, and the banners still flew. To understand how a dynasty can go broke 4 times in 1 century and still dominate a continent, you have to go back to the beginning, to a king drowning in promises, to an empire addicted to war, and to a network of financiers who believed they were clever enough to lend to a monarch who could not be forced into court. When Philip II inherited the crown in 1556, he didn't just inherit lands. He inherited a financial structure already stretched to breaking. He ruled Spain, Portugal later on, large parts of Italy, the Low Countries, and vast colonial territories in the Americas. He saw himself as the defender of Catholicism in a Europe torn by religious conflict. That mission, and the geography of his holdings, demanded soldiers, mercenaries, ships, fortresses, garrisons, and endless supplies. All of that required one thing that the crown never quite had enough of: cash, right now. His father, Charles V, had already pawned much of the future to pay for glory in the past. Taxes had been pushed upward again and again. Offices and titles had been sold. Future revenues had been mortgaged in exchange for immediate funds. By the time Philip took over, the empire was rich in territory and prestige, but chronically short on liquidity. The money never seemed to arrive quite when it was needed. So Philip did what early modern monarchs increasingly did when reality collided with ambition. He turned to high finance. German banking dynasties like the Fuggers and Welsers, and later Genoese banking coalitions, stepped in as imperial lifelines. They advanced money today against taxes that might be collected months or years from now. They wired funds through a network of bills of exchange from Castile to the Low Countries, from Seville to Milan, smoothing the violent ups and downs of war spending. In exchange, they got what the crown could offer: rights to future tax streams, monopolies over certain revenues, control over the handling of silver arriving from the New World, and just as importantly, a privileged place in the political hierarchy. On the surface, it looked like a normal lending relationship. The king borrows, the bankers lend, the taxes repay, and everyone profits. But that neat story breaks down the moment war refuses to stay on budget. War doesn't follow orderly repayment schedules. Armies mutiny if pay is late. Enemies don't wait for your cash flow to improve. Campaigns cost what they cost, and those costs rise with every setback. The crown's expenses moved like a storm. Its revenues moved like a slow river. The first major crack came in 1557, barely a year into Philip's personal rule. Spain was fighting in the Italian wars, supporting operations in the Low Countries, and trying to manage crises on multiple fronts. Meanwhile, silver shipments from the Americas were delayed, and tax income, already squeezed, simply couldn't keep up. The crown's short-term obligations, the asientos, complex loan contracts with bankers, piled up faster than the cash coming in. So Philip did something brutal and simple. He stopped paying. He declared a suspension of payments on key categories of debt. To the bankers, this was a catastrophe, a royal bankruptcy. To the crown, it was leverage. This is the heart of the Habsburg Bankruptcy Cycle. Default was not the final chapter. It was the next move in a negotiation. It was the king flipping the table and saying, "We're going to rearrange the game." It's easy to imagine that this would produce uncontrollable chaos. You might picture riots in Madrid, total collapse of confidence, and a permanent refusal to lend to the crown. But that's not what happened. The suspension was not total. Philip did not repudiate all his debts. Instead, he drew a careful line. Certain short-term contracts were frozen. Others, especially long-term domestic debts backed by Castilian taxes, continued to be serviced. In practice, this meant a kind of controlled demolition. Foreign and short-term creditors bore the brunt. Domestic bondholders, especially those deeply intertwined with the Castilian elite and the political system, were protected as much as possible. The message was clear. The crown might hurt some of its creditors, but it would not burn its entire financial base to the ground. It would punish selectively. What followed each suspension was months, sometimes years, of painful negotiation. The bankers demanded compensation. They leveraged their connections in European courts. They tried to pressure the crown by choking off new credit. But they had a problem. They needed the crown almost as much as the crown needed them. The monarchy was the single largest, most prestigious borrower in Europe. Being shut out of that business was not attractive. Eventually, settlements were reached. Old loans were converted into longer-term bonds. Interest rates were adjusted. Some principal was written down, quietly admitting that it would never be fully repaid. Some creditors were wiped out. Others were folded into new deals on better terms. And then, slowly, almost inevitably, the money started flowing again. Here is the paradox that makes the Habsburg story so disturbing. The more often Spain went bankrupt, the more it proved that lending to it could still be profitable, as long as you understood the unspoken rules. Repeated bankruptcies didn't scare everyone away. They taught the surviving players how the game was really played. Once you see the pattern, it becomes hard to unsee it. War spending surges, outpacing taxes. The crown leans heavily on short-term asientos from groups of bankers. Interest and principal payments begin to consume a dangerous share of tax revenues. The system hits an invisible ceiling beyond which something has to give. The king declares a suspension of payments on targeted debts. Credit freezes. Negotiations begin. Eventually, a grand settlement is reached. Deeper into the future, more tax revenues are pledged. The financial structure is reset, the war machine restarts, and then, given enough time and enough pressure, the cycle repeats. If this still feels abstract, history provides vivid scenes that drag the problem into full color. Consider the crisis of 1575, one of the most dramatic in the Habsburg cycle. By then, German houses like the Fuggers were no longer the main players. Genoese financiers had risen to dominate the crown's credit system. They were not just lenders, they were the operators of the empire's payment system. They ran the fairs of Besançon and Piacenza, where bills of exchange were settled and transfers between Castile and northern Europe were cleared. When Philip suspended payments on their contracts, it wasn't just a handful of rich men in Genoa who felt the shock. It struck at the infrastructure of credit itself. Bills stopped being honored. Commercial fairs failed. Merchants who depended on those settlements found themselves suddenly illiquid. A blockage at the top of the pyramid translated into paralysis at the base. In the Low Countries, Spanish troops went unpaid for months. Soldiers who had fought under the Habsburg flag, expecting wages that never arrived, turned on the very territories they were supposed to defend. The result was the infamous Spanish Fury in Antwerp in 1576, when mutinous troops sacked one of Europe's wealthiest cities, slaughtering civilians and destroying property on a massive scale. The monetary crisis in royal accounts became blood in the streets. From the outside, this looks like madness. Why would a king risk losing his most important commercial hub just to squeeze his creditors? Why risk political catastrophe for the sake of a debt negotiation? Because the crown's problem was not simple insolvency in the modern corporate sense. It still had the power to tax. It still had access to precious metals from the Americas. The fundamental ability to generate resources over time remained. What it lacked was flexibility within the specific contractual framework that had built up over years of borrowing. In effect, the bankers had, by their contracts, imposed a ceiling on how much of future revenue could safely be pledged. The king hit that ceiling. Bankruptcy was his way of breaking through it. The settlement that followed the 1575 crisis, the so-called Medio General, did not end royal borrowing. It reorganized it. Many of the same bankers remained in business with the crown. Their portfolios were rearranged. Their claims were transformed. Some took serious losses. Some gained new privileges. The relationship, strained and reshaped, continued. Default was not an exit from the game. It was how the rules of the game were rewritten. So who actually paid for the Habsburg Bankruptcy Cycle? Not just kings and bankers arguing over ledgers. Ordinary people paid in ways they usually didn't get to vote on. Merchants saw their businesses vaporize when credit froze. Cities like Antwerp paid in fire and blood when unpaid soldiers turned into predators. Taxpayers saw more and more of their future income pledged to service restructured debts, even after the headlines of the crisis had faded. Every solution involved turning short-term negotiable claims into long-term tax-backed obligations. Every reset shifted more of the burden away from the immediate battlefield and onto the long arc of future revenues. The empire kicked the problem forward, deeper into the pockets of people who had no seat at the negotiating table. This is the quiet genius and the quiet cruelty of default as policy. For the king, a bankruptcy was a brutal but effective way to survive another decade of commitments he could not otherwise fund. For the bankers, it was the cost of doing business with a borrower too important to abandon. For the average subject, it was a storm that destroyed livelihoods, raised taxes, and distorted prices, without ever being described as a policy choice they could challenge. The empire walked a narrow line, punished creditors enough to reset the system, but not so much that they stayed away permanently. And the unsettling truth is that they never quite did. As long as the Habsburg monarchy sat at the center of political and economic power in Europe, there were always financiers willing to come back to the table for the next round. Fast forward to today, and the names have changed, but the script may feel strangely familiar. When a modern country defaults, it rarely looks like sudden, total obliteration. More often, it is called a restructuring, a rollover, a haircut. Old bonds are exchanged for new ones. Maturities are extended. Interest rates are trimmed. Some claims are quietly written down. Negotiations are held behind closed doors between governments, banks, and international institutions. A government hits the limits of what it can pay without tearing its society apart. It threatens, implicitly or explicitly, not to pay at all. Creditors calculate how much they are willing to lose to keep the game going. International organizations mediate. Newspaper headlines talk about stability and sustainability. And in the end, a deal is signed. The crisis is declared contained. The old promises are replaced by new promises. Life goes on until the next ceiling. We tell ourselves that this is different, that sophisticated models, prudential rules, and central banks have fundamentally changed the nature of the game. But if you look back at Habsburg Spain with clear eyes, you may find the similarities more striking than the differences. A powerful state with oversized commitments, a network of private creditors who understand the risks and hope to manage them. A sequence of lending, overextension, crisis, suspension, and renegotiation. Default not as moral failure, but as a recurring, if unofficial, part of public finance. There is another layer that makes the Habsburg example especially instructive. Bankruptcy did not eliminate investor appetite. In some ways, it refined it. Lenders learned which kinds of debts would be protected at almost any cost. Bonds deeply tied to core tax streams. Debts held by politically crucial groups, obligations so embedded in the system that repudiating them would threaten the regime itself. They learned which credits were sacrificial, short-term, foreign, peripheral, held by those with less political leverage. In other words, not all creditors were equal in a default, and they knew it. Some lost nearly everything. Some took manageable cuts. Some emerged with even more influence over policy. Default as policy was also default as selection mechanism. It determined which players remained powerful enough to sit at the table for the next negotiation and which ones were quietly removed from the game. For the Habsburgs, the ultimate goal was not a balanced budget or a clean balance sheet. It was survival in a world of rivals. As long as the empire could still raise troops, still dispatch fleets, still enforce taxes, it could afford to bend the rules of finance to its needs. Bankruptcy became part of that bending. So what survives a bankruptcy cycle like this? The specific contracts do not. They are rewritten. The precise numbers do not. They are massaged, redefined, and transformed. What survives is the structure, the idea that the state can reach into the future, pull resources into the present through promises, and when those promises become too heavy, adjust them through controlled failure. For those watching from the outside, another lesson survives as well. Default is not a simple story of sinners and saints, of reckless spenders and innocent victims. It is a policy choice, often made in the shadow between arithmetic and power. The Habsburgs showed that an empire could fail on paper again and again while still projecting strength, still waging war, still shaping history. Today, when you hear about sovereign restructurings, about orderly defaults and debt sustainability, you are hearing the modern language of an old habit, the habit of adjusting promises to keep the political machine alive. The question is not whether governments will sometimes use default, open or disguised, as a tool. History has already answered that. They will. The real question is where you stand when the next cycle breaks. Are you holding claims that can be sacrificed? Are you exposed to promises that depend on everything going right forever? Or do you understand that in the long run, states treat some promises as negotiable and others as sacred? And that the line between the two is drawn in politics and power, not spreadsheets alone? Every bankruptcy cycle is a transfer. From creditors who misjudged the hierarchy of promises to those who understood it. From people who believed in the permanence of contracts to those who studied how often those contracts have melted under pressure. The Habsburgs may be gone, but the pattern they perfected has never really left. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.